All right, why don't we get started? Good afternoon. My name is Jane Moriarty. I'm a professor at the School of Law here, and I welcome you to this breakout session. I hope you're enjoying the day as much as I am. Our first speaker today is Helen Manich. She is the president of Manich Strategies, Inc. They work on disruptive technology in the developing world, and she's going to explain a lot more about what that means. She was part of a team originally at the beginning of her career that built MCI and took it from non-existent to a $9 billion company. And that was only the beginning of her work. She's done fairly amazing things in her career. And she is talking today about mitigating climate change, execution of energy infrastructure projects in the developing world. With much pleasure, I hope you'll join me in welcoming Helen Manich.
Good afternoon. I don't know if I'll be as inspiring as our plenary speaker, but I hope I will take you a bit on an adventure. So who I am is, during the first 20 years of my career, I was about creating part of the telecommunications industry with MCI taking on AT&T, freeing the technology that subsequently became the internet and wireless, then building wireless industries, including Macaw Cellular, which I was head of marketing, through the acquisition of Macaw by AT&T, which was very interesting, having sued them previously, successfully. And then started my own consulting firm and did a lot of work in disruptive technologies around the world with bringing internet and wireless, and then the beginnings of cybersecurity. About 2004, I moved into energy because I said, where we're going to have to really bring innovation is here. And I ended up on a journey I had no clue about. So on the one hand, building an energy infrastructure project that helps to mitigate climate change is no different than doing any energy infrastructure project. You have to, in today's world, for financing and approvals internationally, you've got to make sure you understand the existing social communities. And you've got to make sure that you are bridging the international financial standards. That is something that is a financeable project, but also meets all of the standards of environment, anti-corruption, etc. So in that regard, it's not any different. But here's how it is different. If we look at most developing countries, I'm going to use the phrase DC because I talk a lot about this, they're very heavily fossil fuel based, particularly in electricity generation. It's either hydro or it's fossil fuel. And in most cases, it costs 30 to 38 cents a kilowatt hour. To give you a U.S. comparative, we pay as residents, which is at the high end of the prices in the United States, 8 to 15 cents. Petrol diesel is even worse. In the developing world, you're going to pay $5 to $6.25 a gallon. In the United States, with everybody's profit in, we pay $2.50 to $3.50. I will guarantee you cannot build an economy on those prices. You simply can't. So regardless of climate change, if you want to have economic and income equality, it doesn't start with those numbers. In addition, because in most places, oil is imported, they end up exporting at least 10% of their gross domestic product every year. To give you a sense of how different that is from the United States, our trade balance deficit worldwide is about $45 billion a month. So, we're not talking, the U.S. economy is 18 trillion. I mean, it's nothing. It's not even close to being 10%. What I looked at doing is I have probably spent half of the last 5 to 7 years bumping through potholes in various developing countries in the world, is I looked around, and these pictures that you see are actual pictures of waste that is just very, very common in the developing world. And I kept looking at that and said, matter. That's matter. My driver said, matter? What's the matter? What do you mean? No, matter. And we worked with a developer by the name of Barclays Geddes Group and developed a state-of-the-art, with Siemens and others, a state-of-the-art incineration that really takes landfills that are overwhelmed and health hazards. And landfills in developing countries are not like we know them in the United States. They're dumps. And they very certainly can be mined just like any other ore is mined anywhere in the world. Tires are a particular problem because they create a health problem and breeding ground for malaria in particular. And if we can use what is a problem and, quote, valueless and turn it into value and have the additional benefits of keeping that wealth in the country, bringing down energy costs to be able to develop an economy, well, I think that's a pretty good day. The process that we use is fairly straightforward. What you see is you've got trucks that come in here, and they're dumping it into bins that go into concrete storage. That then is moved into a furnace, and we're doing what usually you do in furnaces. You create steam, and you turn a turbine. The thing is that here we have got state-of-the-art emissions scrubbers, capturing and recovering any of the thermal energy in the form of a high-pressure system. And I can tell you that I live in Alexandria, Virginia, and we have a 30-megawatt waste-to-energy facility. And these facilities actually would emit less than that in my neighborhood and the air that I breathe, which is my standard. It has to be at least as good, if not better, than what I have. And so what's really terrific about this is being able to take a feedstock which would cause great health problems and other issues within those countries and be able to deploy that in the local areas. So one of the things that is a problem in energy in developed countries is you get these huge several hundred megawatt projects that are funded. And the problem is that people in various parts of the country don't get electricity until they build the grid out to them. With this approach, we can get as small as 3 megawatts at a very reasonable price. And therefore, you start really addressing the issue of not creating or not worsening the have and have-nots economic inequality, because you can bring this stuff up in parallel. The other issue is that when you're bringing this up in various cities, is you build those as regional grids with the design to be able to connect into a national grid in a bidirectional manner. What this does is significantly increase the time from someone who doesn't have access to electricity today to when they can. And just to give you a sense of some of the state-of-the-art that you have in this is nanoparticle surface materials, which I didn't know about until probably 05 or 06. One of the reasons that we can really minimize the emissions out of these kind of facilities is we can take the heat levels into the incinerators north, significantly north of 2,000 Fahrenheit. So obviously the more you burn, the less you got to clean up after. In addition, tires are a real problem. And it's really funny because my father built the tire business at Sears. So how I ended up understanding a lot about tires is I listened to my dad and talked to my dad a lot when I was growing up. And so as you see, this is a typical picture of a landfill or a dump of tires. And what we're able to do is those tires, we either are bringing them into the facility or they're part of the flow, but we're able to shred those and we're able to take out the steel belts for recycling. We can use the oil that's in the tire for waste to energy. But we also can take the rubber crumb, which means we're using everything. And you can replace 14% of tar oil in asphalt with rubber crumb. And particularly in tropical areas, it provides a much more highly functional and durable road because of the heat. And so this is looking at how do we take something that has no value today, but create value, but in a manner that comes with keeping the people in mind. Now, keeping the people in mind on our second project was even more so. I went on what I could best describe as a listening and being in the question for 2.5 years, going around countries, and asking farmers and business people what their problems were so that I could understand why, whether they were a farmer or a small business person, what were the barriers. And of course, energy is the whole thing, because whether it's lights, whether you've got to refrigerate for your agriculture, other kinds of things, having a really high cost of fuel practically breaks the back, and on top of that, likely interest rates of 17%. So what we're used to here as far as 4 to 6% for business loans in the United States doesn't exist out there. Doesn't happen. So what we did is I looked at a lot of projects of jatropha, which can be a bush or a tree, depending on how you farm it. But I looked at projects in India and Madagascar and other places. And what was really fascinating to me is that if you went in but were a big agribusiness, well, you had to corrupt the officials so you could steal the land from the people who were on it, and then you had to move the people off who are very upset, and they've got civil issues, civil societal issues. And maybe you hire them back as sharecroppers, but then you've got to spend a lot of money building fences and walls and security around it, and et cetera, et cetera. I said, you know, I've built a lot of businesses. That doesn't look like a really good business model to me. And what I came up with was, why can't the small farmers keep their land? Why can't we be a public-private partnership with them? Well, one of the biggest issues was when you're going to do financing of big projects on a big scale, the commercial financial markets want to deal with somebody who's a bigger entity. And they want somebody who can make sure that the collateralizing of the project, which is the produce, is actually going to get to market or get into oil. So it took me about 1.5 years of talking with people and kicking things around, but we came up with, and I'm going to very simplify the model, that if farmers got into cooperatives and collectives with each other, you now create the corporate entity to enable commercial financing at low rates. That's one. Two is you now can get economies of scale because, particularly with jatropha or any other agriculture, water infrastructure is absolutely key, and it's expensive. But if you have got a public-private partnership and a cooperative, now you've got the economies of scale that make a whole lot of sense. So we were able to structure a project in which in 5 years we will be able to have over 300,000 hectares in production, generate 12 to 15,000 barrels per day, not small potatoes, it's pretty good size, but most importantly at around $3. That's huge. So we now can create an economy in which people can count on what their energy prices are going to be. And as we deploy best practices, and if we're able to get the oil from the seeds to be higher than we have planned, then we will split that 50-50 with the farmers. So everybody is therefore aligned in the same best interest. In addition to having a predictable revenue stream, you'll see from when I get into showing you some of the pictures that we can develop fuel pellets, which is very important because many developed countries have real issues like we did, as Dr. Ali pointed out last night, with deforestation. And so being able to create a fuel that is not cutting down trees is really important. Last but not least is there have been a lot of people who have been concerned that programs like this take away land from agriculture for edible products. There is a lot of land that you can put jatropha on that agriculture doesn't exist today or low yield agriculture sits on. One of the things you'll see as we get into this is we'll be able to, number one, intercrop, and two, take the hulls and the seed cake from this and put it back into the land, which is going to help reconstruct the land for greater and further agriculture. So I would argue, and I have argued, that jatropha can in fact expand the amount of land that is there for agriculture. It does not need to eat into it. So very quickly, just to look at how this goes. The farmers, via their collectives, maintain ownership of their land, and through that, they are the ones who get the creation of the wealth. One of the things that we get is we get a person who is very vested in the success of the program. They're very vested in this being successful for them. So myself and our partner Barclays Energy Group will be providing the necessary capital and resources, and the two things that matter a great deal are water infrastructure and pruning. And so we're working with USDA, FDA, others who, instead of having to reinvent the wheel, we can do soil testing, we can do a lot of things. I'm going to be working with Michelle Zuckerman-Parker, who, her folks must be in the other room, but she is a MacArthur Foundation grant awardee and has done this wonderful program earlier this year here in Pittsburgh of bringing food from grocery stores that is still good food but would be thrown out because they're just replaced in the box. And the students in working together have, January through May, I think that they deployed 38,000 pounds of food in 5 food deserts in Pittsburgh. And the students also wrote a software to provide and manage that supply chain, including what people needed. These kids are going to work with kids from these other countries to do the same, to do various things, but on supply chains that affect agriculture and jatropha. And that way, both sets of people can really learn from each other, and I'm really, in particular, excited about that. So they collect this and they bring it to a station where we're collecting the product, and it goes into the feedstock facility, and we load it up, we make it into biofuel. And what's great about this is that with jatropha, we do not have to refine or distill. We have to clarify the oil. And it is a one-for-one replacement for diesel. What's great about that? Most developing countries, most engines are diesel, whether they're cars, trucks, or generators. So what's great is creating this fuel source that does not require a replacement of existing capital. So it comes in and then basically goes into the distribution of the oil. This gives you a sense of the harvest and the seeds, and we're breaking apart those seeds and husks and hulls. Say that fast. Then we go into the crushing and the extraction. The cake here is then turned into pellets or briquettes to be used for cooking and other things. And then what's also left goes back to the farmers in the form of fertilizer. And then we have biodiesel that comes out here and bioglycine that comes out as well. So we end up using and recycling everything. Everything gets used. So the farmers end up with several new revenue sources. The nursery plants to begin to build the orchards, the revenue from the produce, they get the fertilizer, they get the briquettes, and the other thing is that because you're intercropping plants, they also build a lot more beehives and they're able to sell the honey. So we've really, I mean, this has taken several years to kind of come to this, but obviously I'm very much in love with what we're working on here. Now, so what's the problem? Well, you have people who have vested interests that are locked in fossil fuel. And they are predominantly monopolies that are controlled by elite families or oligopolies, and they're able to maintain the very high prices because that's going into their pocket, and they're not really interested in having economic growth, and they don't really mind having to maintain the poverty because it's kind of worked for them for a couple of decades. And it is that harsh. It is that in your face. In many cases, the public utilities on electricity are only collecting 30 to 50% of the revenues, and in many cases, it's not the common people who are stealing the electricity. The elites set up gangs to steal the electricity and then sell it to the peasants. It's very, very difficult. But without a firm, stable revenue collection, it's almost impossible to collect financeable, to maintain and get financeable power purchase. I'm going to jump ahead because we've only got a few more minutes. But the real issue as we get into this, and you'll be able to see this on the website, and what I've done is to various sources that this comes from. You can click on that and go to these sources and learn a lot about the cancer of corruption. But to quote a variety of people that are behind this statement, follow the money and you will find out how and why corruption has become public enemy number one for those who are promoting global development as crony capitalists in the private sector who connive with corporate officials in the public sector to short-circuit sound business practices, reward self-interested insiders, subvert the public interest, and undermine the ideals of good governance. There's probably sentences and thoughts from about 10 to 12 people. What I was going to go through, and you'll be able to see this on the website, is I was going to give you 5 very good examples. All of these are in the public domain. In Senegal, Minister Karim Wade was recently convicted of amassing 178 million euros. He was convicted and sentenced to 6 years in prison, fined $230 million, and that was March 15th of this year. The court found over 100 irregularities and violations of corruption. When you have the Minister of Energy and Infrastructure doing that, it's pretty hard to get deals through, and the people really suffer. Very quickly in Nigeria, much the same thing. The reason I put this here was that just about a year ago, the U.S. was able to confiscate and fine $458 billion that President Abacha had taken, but that's only a portion of the $3 billion that we believe has been looted. The Nigerian National Petroleum Company is accused of taking over $1 billion over the last 19 months. It's very hard to do projects. But let's not just look at dictators. Let us understand that we have problems with the big banks as well. HSBC in December of 2012 agreed to pay $1.9 billion to settle U.S. criminal and federal and civil investigations. They deferred prosecution for 5 years. However, the Justice Department announced 6 weeks ago that they're going to go ahead with those criminal prosecutions because they broke their agreement. They continued to launder money. And these guys were the guys who were the preferred financial institution for the drug traffickers and the money launderers. Oh, and let us not forget what was in the news last week, but Volkswagen. As someone who has built many companies and has asked people to give me their hard-earned money for a service, I take great exception to a CEO who says that he did not know that for several years, over 11 million cars worldwide, that they had put proprietary software on to spew out an additional 35x of the legal limit of nitrous oxide. So Pope Francis, I read his encyclical, and I'm a good Jewish girl. Beautiful writing, really, really beautiful. But he really nails this when he talks about the thirst of power, because while this is about money, it is also really about power. I get to do this because I can get away with it. What I've done for you is I've put various things that are in the document that are global actions about corruption, but also I gave you additional click-through sites for which you'll be able to spend a lot of time working on. So my message is, I agree with Richard Alley, we can scale and scope to solve the problem. There are people like me who know how to solve this on big projects and know how to deal with Wall Street to get it done. But now I've had to spend a good chunk of my time in the last few years dealing with corruption, and I got to tell you, I ain't stopping until it's done, because that's what I can do. Thank you.
I suddenly want to leave the law and go into corporate development with you. It was really inspirational. Thank you. It was very, very interesting. Our next speaker is a member of the organizing committee, Dr. Robert Srauf. He is the Thomas J. and Marie C. Murren Chair in Global Competitiveness and Professor of Supply Chain Management in Duquesne's Donahue Graduate School of Business, which, by the way, is the #1 ranked U.S. MBA in Sustainability program. We were able to steal Bob away from my alma mater, BC College, as people at Harvard call it, BC College. And the focus of his work is on sustainability theory and models, as well as sustainability tools. He has written books in the plural. He has published widely in many of the top journals in his field. And today he is presenting on operationalizing organizational sustainability and the integrity of creation. With much pleasure, I hope you'll join me in welcoming Bob Sroof.
Thank you very much. I think the key takeaway from that is to get on the planning committee, right, if you want to get your paper accepted to the conference. I think we should be around here somewhere. All right, so I'm trying to combine a business background in operations and supply chains with an understanding of how large multinational companies do this. And the timing is perfect because this is also another proxy for what is integrity of creation. So within that context, I'll continue being one of those people that are here not on behalf of the corporate raiders of the past who have done everything wrong, right, and trying to defend them, but instead trying to educate people and think about the way we move forward in the future so that way we do not repeat our mistakes of the past, but instead have a totally different future in front of us than we wouldn't have had otherwise. Within this context, then my charge in being in front of you is to provide some new insight to you. So being a true academic, all the rest of the slides will be just black and white text and graphs and numbers, and I'll say just how fast it takes for you to fall asleep. Hopefully that's not the case either. I want to tell a story about this, but tell the story within the research context in which I'm trying to do this. To that end, I'll talk about the research questions, some of the trends that are taking place, my methods for trying to extract this information from large corporations and the people that are in charge of their global operations for sustainability, and then tell you what I found from this. Along the way, for the students in the audience, I'll probably give you some hints as to what to do or not to do based on what's in my slides. This is what we're all facing, right? If I guess I could have gone to the encyclical and made that into a Wordle also. This is the Wordle based on what we're doing at this conference. If you think about the amount of information coming out on sustainability, it's like drinking from a fire hose. How do we actually funnel all this down into something that we can apply, something that's understandable? And this is the crux of what I want to try and do with my research, is sort through all this different wording, but get to the meaning that's underlying this and the tools that can enable us to move forward. To that end, sustainability has typically been defined by the United Nations as meeting the needs of a current generation without compromising the needs of a future generation. That goes back to 1987. I wanted to make this very broad and very simple in my approach to the research and just saying, I want to look at those things that provide economic and non-economic impacts. And I want to look at this within the context of operations and supply chains because of their global reach. The context for this are typically large companies in doing it, but I also want to take into account that there's been numerous ways to look at this, right? The definition that's there from the Brundtland Corporation has been there for quite some time, but it's also been called green, it's been called responsible, it's been called corporate citizenship, it's been called ethics by some. And these are really things that are a proxy for integrity and creation. And that's how I've also kind of set this up in terms of what sustainability is really trying to represent, but then trying to figure out how companies actually operationalize this. So if you want more information on this, you can even go to the United Nations, continue to work on this in the Global Compact, and 12,000 organizations that have signed on to say they want to be more sustainable. For more information on the encyclical itself, our library website at the Gumberg Library has not only the encyclical itself and links to it, but a whole host of other information that is overwhelming in itself, but really enriching the encyclical itself and more information about that. So is anybody taking notice of this? Are anyone in the corporate sectors really looking at the importance of this? Information from consultancies such as the Sloan Management Review publication, the Boston Consulting Group, try to do an annual survey of this information. What they found by looking at over 3,000 corporations, and most of them very large typically, so at least 1/3 of them see this as directly contributing to their profits. Another 2/3 say that it's really necessary for competitiveness, and this isn't going to go away. And they've been saying this for multiple years. But they've also got this category that they call their upper quartile. About 24% of the respondents say that it is integrated into their operations, which is, okay, where my research focus is and what I'm really interested in. They also say it's a way to enlist and engage employees like never before. And it's because of this type of information, gives me the energy to wake up every day and want to better understand this stuff so I can share it with students, learn from people that are doing this, and help people be better informed to make better decisions than they would have otherwise. Who wants to make a decision with less information? Typically no one. So why not have that information include not only financial returns, which we saw a lot of in the previous slide, but also the social context wrapped around that, the environmental impacts not caused by those operations. Then maybe there's a different value proposition for how we make decisions when moving forward. So to this end, some trends. About 1,000 companies right now have half of the total market value of 60,000 companies in the world. If we look at Walmart, and they've been held up in this example before in this context, they're the equivalent of the 25th largest economy in terms of GDP based on their annual revenues. So this means that we can have some fun with this in maps, right, and say that they're bigger than 157 other countries. And some people have done this in the context of other companies and what they're equivalent to. And I know revenues isn't the same as GDP, but still it's one kind of fun way for us to think about things a little bit differently. Because right now corporations are responding to global disasters faster than governments can. And there are new opportunities that are afforded to these organizations, not just to make a profit, but to make a shared value approach to an impact. So to go back to some of this, then 25 U.S. companies are actually larger than the gross domestic product of other countries. And interestingly enough, almost all but one of the S&P 500 are reporting sustainability. The one holdout is the Zion Bank in Utah. But everyone else is doing this, and this has been a growing trend over time. There's also new things taking place in terms of carbon pricing. If you haven't heard of the social cost of carbon, then you can go to the White House and .gov website for the social cost of carbon and see how we've been able to put a price and a value on this, and also with different discount rates into the future, and trying to look at what carbon really means. It's hard for us to get our hands around 29 cubic feet of something, right? But that's a ton of carbon. We displaced so much of that to create this conference. We did offsets to try to call it carbon neutral because of that. There's a way to reward companies that are better performing and have less impacts on their environment, and carbon offsetting is one way in which we can try to help supplement their revenue. But within this vein, and why multinationals are important to look at, the question was, and the caveat to the graduate students, right, is of the infinite set of questions I could ask, oh no, how do I funnel this down to something meaningful, right? Well, that's the keep calm and formulate your research question part of this. I simply wanted to understand why and how these companies do this in a real general sense. But that's also a way for me to look at this as exploratory research that gets at an insight that cannot come from secondary data sources. I can't pull this from Bloomberg terminals, in terms of numerics and financials from that company, but instead I can talk to people that are actually doing this inside them. What I hope this then gets me to is an opportunity for qualitative-based research and field studies with a scripted format to them. I also have to go through the process, right, of comparative literature review and seeing what's already been done so I don't reinvent the wheel and find gaps in the literature in doing this. I can set up my own theoretical model for what I think may be happening, and then I get to jump into actually talking to people that, first I have to convince that this is important enough for them to actually want to be part of, because these people have other things to do with their time. So within that context, I'll get into the sample a little bit. But once we got to that point, I was able to do qualitative data analysis based on scripted interviews using QSR and Vivo software and coding at the sentence level. We probably collected, and I had multiple people with me when doing this, over 200 and some pages of interviews and a number of codes that come out of that we'll see in just a little bit. Multiple coders help with validity and some reliability for the insights that we provide from this. And it may even start to look like things when you put it in pictures in terms of social network analysis on one side, or even just node and parent node and I guess child node contents in terms of how you can space some of this information out to find new insight. The result, I hope, is a different and new approach to trying to figure this out. This sets the stage for further research. So here's the nuts and bolts of the questions I asked and kept them pretty much wide open. I want to know how and why they were doing sustainability. I wanted to know what it meant to actually get people to achieve these objectives and how they did this, again, within a large multinational environment. Some of these people were involved with almost 250,000 employees in one organization in a global context. So their insight is quite rich. How do they collaborate with these people? And then also what obstacles do they find? As we saw from the previous presentation, the obstacles can be insurmountable sometimes. Then I wanted to look at different sustainability initiatives in a different country context. And then finally, the fun part is asking them to tell a story about how sustainability drove something forward. A new launch, a new to-market strategy, or new product, or whatever it may be. How these things are supported by IS and IT, And then the real important question in the end too, right? Since I do not know anything, or enough of anything really in this, tell me what I overlooked. Because I have a notion going into this what this should be. I'm pretty sure that they have more insight than I do and can help me with the last one. What came out of this? I screened companies that were from the Dow Jones Sustainability Index that recognized as leaders. There were also Newsweek Green Rankings, which is underlined by MSCI Global Socrates. I looked at a cross-sector approach to this and have companies now, more in the sample than are reported here. I'm only looking at 17, but large multinational companies across industry sectors. Also those that are typically recognized for doing these types of things. The respondents were such as they were in charge of global operations. They were in multi-billion-dollar companies. They had an average of 10 years experience, an average of 88,000 employees, but in the high end, 426,000, and lower end, about 6,000. They're involved in reporting initiatives to external stakeholders. The Global Reporting Initiative is that. Also, the Carbon Disclosure Project. They had certified our ISO 14000 is an environmental management system certification, and they were involved in the built environment. You know, why have, as the speaker mentioned last night, a 4% discount rate, which means in 30 years something is worth zero in value, when we're putting up buildings that are going to last 50 or 100 or 150 years. So to this end, they're involved in leadership in electrical and environmental design. These are the types of people I talked to and their titles. Some of these had some overlap, so there's some duplicate. But this really is kind of setting the stage for these people who were important enough to talk to because they had their hands on the levers of the organizations that could create change and move something in a sustainable direction. This is the slide that's the caveat to the students, right? Too small a font, too much information, don't do this. You are better than us, or at least should be after coming out of a program. But the real takeaway from this is that there's quite a bit of coding that went on with multiple coders, or 4 different people coding, including myself. So 855 parent codes and then more child codes underneath that. They were broken out by question area, and then we went to do a deeper dive into the content of this and to see what comes out of it. And that's where some of the value really comes from the coding process itself. So this is the new conceptual model that really starts to talk about why, how, the enablers for this, and what performance is important. So to the why question, I found that companies that were doing this longer were much better at this, and especially if they came from a parent kind of environment where there was a family that started the business, and this had been going for a much longer period of time. Those companies that were also involved in business to consumer or B2C environments were much more engaged in this. And one example of this was Johnson & Johnson. They've had the same vision statement for over 70 years. It has sustainability all over it, but they don't use the word sustainability. And they've always looked at this in this corporate social responsibility type of an environment, and they've never had to change that. In terms of why, and the next one down, external drivers, the environmental impacts. Everyone's much more aware of it now. I can go to the grocery store with my smartphone, right? I can take a picture of a barcode on a product, and it can tell me the environmental attributes of that product and the social attributes of it against all the other products on that same shelf, in the same product category. That information is driving people to then value waste. Waste is something that should be minimized. CO2 and greenhouse gas emissions are just another indication of waste. Why would I want to buy a product from a company that creates more waste than one that doesn't? And that's what we're really getting at with CO2. How do they do this? Teams, teams, teams. The more people that they can engage and the more they can spread this throughout an organization, the more successful it will be. It starts in design with sustainability attributes built into product design and thinking early on. And it includes what I don't call a triple bottom line anymore, but an integrated bottom line. Social, financial, and environmental performance metrics early in the process of performance measurement. That is a sign of integration that comes early, but it also follows through to the end. And information systems are there to help enable this. What is being measured though, right? What's important? Goals and KPIs to keep it funneled or narrow. The smaller the number, typically the better people can relate to it. What people don't really know is that for every publicly traded company in the United States, there are already 700 environmental performance metrics for that individual company that's out there. If you think no one's watching you and what you're doing, you're probably wrong. Rankings are important, especially external rankings like the Dow Jones Sustainability and Newsweek and other rankings that could tout what they're doing. They were involved in global reporting initiatives, or GRI. And some of the more important metrics that came out of this include these, and these are in rank order as to how we coded them. So the low-hanging fruit seems to be energy, in direct relationship to GHG emissions and CO2. The rest of these are all waste-based. But the nice thing coming into this in terms of the top 10 list is more focus on social performance metrics. it's really hard to get our hands around the environment, even though that's the external stuff usually coming out of a firm. Since 1970, we've been measuring a lot of this. The social is even more difficult. The nice thing is there's a lot of performance metrics out there and templates and different approaches for us to try to use or leverage. When we go back to this from the operations and supply chain perspective, I also wanted to see where the collaborative opportunities came from and the obstacles that got in the way. Ironically, for me, since I teach this with our students, and maybe not as much ironically as it is purposeful, we go through life cycle assessment in our courses. Our students can look at a paperclip and tell you the 100-year global warming potential for a single unit of product, being that paperclip. And then we can look at how that would change if we manufactured it in China or manufactured it in Pittsburgh. This type of information is also what's infiltrating supply chains and enabling new information and how they manage raw material extraction all the way to finished products going to end customers within a manufacturing environment. Some of my companies also weren't just manufacturers. They're also involved in the service sector where LCA isn't used as much. But if I look at a company like EMC, they're creating whole new design environments to design the technology and the backbone behind cloud computing in virtual environments where they didn't need brick and mortar offices, but instead could have people collaboratively work around the world in real time, one after another, on a project in a cloud space that was sort of their virtual office. And these are ways in which they could then look at a life cycle of a product, and they actually did use life cycle assessment when trying to look at the physical products that were going to be behind the services they provided. Obstacles. No one seems to understand what sustainability is, right? I have a new colleague I'm trying to work with at Boston College, who's a PhD student who's done almost 100 interviews now within one company, and from top down through the company. And ironically, she's finding that no two people see sustainability as the same thing. And these are the sustainability and the green teams that she's actually interviewing across the organization. And everyone has a different view of what this means. So there's a great opportunity then for us to understand how to better educate people in this early in a process when onboarding them in a company, have common metrics so that they can understand how that relates to their own performance, and get away from the myopic focus on just cost. The last part of this is the change management opportunity in terms of integrated bottom lines that capture more than just financial information, are what we're looking to, in the combination of a financial report and a sustainability report becoming one. Innovation being a new way in which the term sustainability is being coined. I'm actually trying to call it innovation, and who wouldn't want, or sorry, integration. Who wouldn't want to work for an integrated company versus a non-integrated company? And hopefully they're all innovative or they wouldn't be in that space to begin with. Lifecycle assessment becomes more prevalent for change management. And we have environmental health and safety systems of the past that have now migrated into environmental management systems and have become sustainable operating systems. And now firms are measuring these things not only within their own four walls, but also within the inbound supply chain and the outbound value chain to their end customer. Now, one more slide for the students and tell them what not to do. The other outcomes from this were a process-based approach to looking at going back to the literature and looking at the findings from the research, and looking at a phased approach to what integration and operationalization of sustainability might look like. Phase 1 is operationalized. Phase 2 is materiality. Phase 3 is then integration. So I'll help you focus on some things. Early on, definition of ambiguity is either an enabler or it gets in the way of some things. Below this, we see things like environmental management systems at least going beyond environmental health and safety, and a recognition of an unbalanced sheet in terms of typical performance measures and how we capture them in the past. And that unbalanced sheet has an opportunity for us to capture new information. That usually helps us move into metrics, big data explosions, but also big analytics in terms of what we could do with new information. If you're a financial analyst, do you want to know just the financials of the company, or do you want to know about the risk profile involved in the environment, also social aspects of them, governance, whether or not women are on the board, and how they empower them throughout the organization, how people are trained, how they're paid, whether or not there is even equal pay. The more information you have, the better the decision you can make. We see things like the social cost of carbon coming into play. And across the board, we see a transition from only financial measures of the past, like a discounted cash flow or net present value, moving into a sustainable value added and trying to incorporate a triple bottom line into this, moving then into a more integrated approach. In the far right, as I talked about the GDP of companies before being larger than countries, why not look at the equivalent of a gross domestic happiness? It's really the same measurement as total quality was in the past. How good a product are you putting out into the environment for those people that are willing to pay for that service or that product? Gross domestic happiness may be one way in which a company might better relate to how its performance is measured and how it can be related to and rolled up into an actual national level for an integration that's at a country level, not just at an organizational level. So to take this a little bit farther and transitioning into phase 3 and integration, There's no more landfills there are no landfills in the environment to begin with. And ironically, we're presenting today in a space that has 5 of them within 20 miles. We have the lowest tipping fees of any state. Do we really want to be known as the garbage dump of the United States? No. There should never be any landfills, and instead these things should become the raw materials of the future for any kind of products we want to be able to create. Some have already claimed they'll be the gold mines of the future. Finally, an integrated bottom line. It helps us look at performance that has a value statement, not just a profit and loss statement. And instead of a change in shareholder equity of the past, it's a change in stakeholder equity. We take into account better materiality, engagement, and insight from those stakeholders that are involved in companies to create better products and services for them. That is pretty much what I wanted to try to share with you today. The last slide is more of a takeaway or a placeholder for Q&A. But to quote Pope Francis, businesses are important. They're the opportunity to employ and engage people and move whole societies forward. So let's not discount everything that they've got to do yet into our future because they've done something wrong in the past. And there's nothing more compelling than the time to do this right now. We've waited for too long to get to where we are, and there's too far to go. So I look to you, the students in the audience, and others to make better decisions, to make sure this happens.
So, yeah, why don't we have about 10 minutes, 10 minutes. So do we have questions for our panelists? Yes, just directly to the person.
I talk to Robert every day.
Yeah, I never take questions from him anyway.
Okay.
I'll ask a question. So I see Jethro building forward. I want to see if you thought about some unintended consequences of choices that can come out tomorrow, but maybe 5 years down the road.
I've tried. Whether I have successfully done that or not, time will tell. Part of the way that I have tried to deal with that is by having a continual feedback loop with the farmers and really all of the various stakeholders in this, so that we define the problem very much like an engineering question and are pulling it out in a 3-dimensional way. So the kinds of questions we asked was, we challenged ourselves on the issue of, well, are we going to be bumping agriculture, edible agriculture? I think we've answered that question. How long will these trees last? They can last 25 to 40 years. We're certainly with biodiesel using a much lower carbon polluting than diesel is, and we are creating wealth at the personal level and an economy in general for the community. I'm about to turn 60, and I can say that you really can't see around the corner. We have tried to learn from others and look at a lot of things that would give us hints about questions to ask. So I'm always interested in being in the question. I think we've tried to do some very good due diligence about this and try to mitigate what could be risks down the road. Unfortunately, I can't see around the corner, but I can tell you just with the questions I've given you that we have tried to be thoughtful about the impact of this down the road. I think that we've tried to design this so this is something that really can sustain an economy and a people for the next 20 to 50 years. So, we'll see, but I will tell you we are not casual nor nonchalant about saying, well, what can be unintended consequences, and constantly asking that question so that we work on structure to deal with it.
Yes.
I'm intrigued by the concept of the integrated bottom line. You had any discussions with industry where there's still many who are struggling with the concept of the triple bottom line? They're seeing the other aspects, but that profit is bright red. But I love the concept.
Yeah.
I wonder how you might discuss it.
Okay. Usually I'm loud enough to do this in a room by myself. So the question was, what kind of acceptance is there to an integrated bottom line when there's already pushback on a triple bottom line? and the focus is typically on either the black or the red, right, in terms of just financial outcomes. So to that end, we've actually been working with Hunter Levins, the Natural Capitalism Consultancy Group, in trying to understand what an integrated bottom line may look like and actually proposing some of them with different line items capturing information about firms, because ironically, 80% of the value of a company is in intangibles. So what we actually see in a balance sheet is only a percentage of the value of the company. It's only really measured in dollars. So to that extent, there is information online within the natural capitalism sphere for this. And we have been trying to propose this with different measures. And a student I'm working with, a different graduate student, we're now incorporating this information into things like a lighting retrofit. So we can take a 6.5-year payback period for a lighting retrofit. And if we can convince someone that environmental impacts avoided and the social value created are important, we can bring the payback period for that down from 6.5 years to 3 months. And this is the way in which we'll start chipping away at the integrated bottom line. Another nice thing that shows some momentum in this direction is that there is more traction with an integrated report in terms of a financial report and a sustainability report being done at one time. Southwest Airlines does it, Bear Material Sciences, or Bear, does it in the parent company. And there's a growing number of firms that are doing that, and more traction with the Sustainable Accounting Standards Board, SASB, created by Bob Eccles out of Harvard. So those things I think align to help show there's some momentum, but there's a long way to go.
Do we have other questions? We have a little more time? Yes. Oh, excuse me.
I have a waste to energy question.
Yeah.
And I know that your model is saying in maybe developing places where you have less infrastructure, is that, like, why don't we have more here?
Well,
Could you repeat her?
okay, her question was, given that we're talking about waste to energy in developing countries, why don't we have more in the United States? Really good question. In Northern Virginia, we have 3 waste to energy facilities that have been upgraded repeatedly, but in the city of Alexandria, where I live, waste to energy provides 35% of the residential electricity. And that's not nothing when you've got a hot summer and air conditioning going all the time. There are 3 barriers with regards to waste to energy, and I'm going to use New York City and Rudolph Giuliani as an example. We all know Rudy thinks he's a pretty tough guy and he knows how to negotiate a tough deal. Problem is, the city doesn't own the waste. The company that decades ago they farmed out the waste collection to, Waste Management, does. And if you put waste to energy facilities throughout the 5 boroughs of Manhattan, Waste Management would not have revenue. So they own the waste, and until their contract is done, they are not going to have waste to energy facilities in New York City. That is one issue. Another issue is that there are very bad deals that were cut by some municipalities in which, quite candidly, they got taken by the utilities. There were a few, very notably here in Pennsylvania. And so people have said, well, maybe this isn't such a good deal. I would say, having understood what was going on in those situations, that they got the people who negotiated on the behalf of the municipality accepted a very bad deal. The third is that all of us, in our own ways, who care very much about sustainability and the integrity of creation, there are people who very much oppose waste to energy facilities because they believe it encourages people to create waste. I understand their point of view, but as a marketer and a strategist, I tend to be a little bit more based in, well, I would like people to do things less, and I can encourage that by various incentives, but I've also got to deal with this issue. What you are saying in China is China, which has a waste problem that is biblical disaster, is starting now to deploy waste energy facilities throughout China. And it's one of the key ways that they're going to move from coal and into something that is more sustainable. But what I would say is, with anything, you have to have in the United States a willing party to take on some of the difficult challenges and do that. And unfortunately, in our economic system, we like to do projects that are easy to finance and not ones that are more difficult. So But I will say that the ownership of the waste stream is a real barrier.
I'd like you to join me in thanking our fabulous participants today. This was great. Thank you so much.